So almost invariably, in any discussion of the Cold War, the idea that the Soviet bloc repressed human rights will arise. And so will the idea that those who were in charge of these countries either didn't care or that human rights didn't exist there. But human rights were heavily studied in the Soviet bloc and were the basis of the society in each of those countries. One of the most infamous suppressors of human rights, East Germany's Ministry for State Security, the Stasi, took the concept of what is a violation of a human right very seriously, as they knew that they needed to be seen as a legitimate authority by the people they had control over. But to define the concept of what a violation of a human right is, you first need to define what is a legitimate human right. And to East Germany, one of the most important moments in history where you can make this definition of what is a legitimate human right was also shared by their ideological enemy, the American Revolution. Because of how the term has come to be used in the West, it can be excused that many do not fully appreciate that the American Revolution was exactly that. A revolution. As presented by the American Yawp, the revolution built institutions and codified the language and ideas that still define Americans' image of themselves. Moreover, revolutionaries justified their new nation with radical new ideals that changed the course of history and sparked a global age of revolution. Less than a century after its conclusion, it would be stated that the American Revolution had provided the idea of one great democratic republic from whence the first Declaration of the Rights of Man was issued, and that it had given the first impulse to the European Revolution of the 18th century. Put succinctly, the American War of Independence sounded the tocsin for the European middle class. So said by Karl Marx. But to first get there, East German education had to lay the groundwork for why it happened. According to the Class 7 history textbook of East Germany from 1989, between 1607 and 1733, 13 British colonies were established. These colonies' population was not made up of native inhabitants, but of settlers. Most of the settlers were English farmers who had lost their land. Many settlers had also left their homeland to escape political and religious persecution of feudal exploitation. There were also English nobles who hoped to establish feudal estates in America. The number of colonists grew quickly. While there were around 40,000 English people living in the colonies in 1640, by 1750 there were over 1 million. This led to an immediate consequence. The natives, the Indian tribes, were driven from their land and their traditional hunting grounds in bloody battles. Since the freedom-loving Indians refused to be subjugated, the British bourgeois and the government had no use for them. They were therefore supposed to make room for European settlers who paid taxes, delivered raw materials to Great Britain, and brought goods there. The colonial authorities began a campaign of extermination against the Indians. Further, the colonies soon developed key differences. In the north, cities emerged in which shipbuilding, fishing, wood processing, and iron extraction and processing became established. While in the south, the so-called plantation economy prevailed. The plantations were huge agricultural operations that primarily grew cotton, tobacco, corn, and rice. The work was done by slaves. The growing strength of the colonies scared the English bourgeois, who passed restrictive laws against the colonists. And by the time of the 7 Years' War, anti-British sentiment emerged in the colonies. After the war ended, the differences intensified. The government wanted to shift the burden of the war onto the colonies. It introduced strict control of trade and production. In order to squeeze even more money out of the colonies, they leveled new taxes. The Stamp Act passed in 1765 was particularly hated. The colonists attempted to move out of the supervision of colonial authorities, but not wanting to lose taxpayers, the British government issued a ban on new settlements west of the Appalachians in 1763. This settlement ban caused a storm of indignation not only among farmers. Rich southern plantation owners like George Washington were also outraged because they wanted to expand their huge holdings at the expense of the Indians. As all sections of the population were suffering, more and more colonists felt that it was time to separate from England and form an independent state. Several associations emerged to defend the interests of the colonists. The most important was that of the Sons of Liberty. They denied the English Parliament the right to pass laws for the colonies because the colonists were not represented in Parliament. On March 25, 1770, British soldiers opened fire in Boston at an anti-British rally. 3 men died immediately. 2 died from their serious injuries. In the Boston Massacre, the first Americans died in conflict with the colonial power. By 1774, a Continental Congress was formed in solidarity between the colonies, who wanted to negotiate a solution with Great Britain. The British government refused all negotiations. They wanted to suppress the independence movement using armed force. The colonists were ready to fight for independence. In January 1775, the British government ordered the unrestricted use of military force to enforce the laws of Parliament in the colonies. To protect themselves, the colonists formed a militia whose members were called Minutemen because they were ready for action very quickly. On April 19, 1775, the first battle between British forces took place near Lexington and Concord. This battle began the War of Independence of the British colonies in North America, which lasted until 1783. With the groundwork laid for how the Revolution occurred, studies turned towards how the outcome was achieved. The colonists formed an army under George Washington, but initially only suffered defeats with high losses. The craftsmen, workers, and farmers had little military experience and were initially poorly armed. The British troops, on the other hand, were excellently trained and well equipped. They were reinforced by German soldiers who had sold German territorial princes to Great Britain. Washington's army was able to gradually transform, finding help from those such as Lafayette and the let me ask my Polish girlfriend how you say that.
Tadeusz Kościuszko.
And the former Prussian officer Steuben. Then on July 4th, 1776, the Continental Congress adopted the Declaration of Independence, which was embraced by all progressive civil forces in Europe as a revolutionary pamphlet against feudalism. The trading and manufacturing bourgeois and the plantation owners ruled in the new state. Slavery had not been abolished. Slaves and Indians were excluded from the solemnly proclaimed human rights. The war turned conclusively in the favor of the United States at the Battle of Saratoga in October 1777. France, Spain, and the Netherlands entering the war against Great Britain also contributed to the American victory. In summary, the British colonies in North America fought for their freedom from colonial rule. The War of Independence was fought primarily for free capitalist development. It was a bourgeois revolution. As a result, the bourgeois republic, the USA, emerged. The USA's Declaration of Independence in 1776 was of fundamental importance for the development of progressive thought in Europe and the revolutionary struggle against feudalism. So, did you catch it? The American Revolution is summarized as one of the most significant events in history, especially revolutionary history. But it's in the everything that it wasn't that it becomes important for East German education and their idea of human rights. The American Revolution was just one step in the greater teaching of the revolutionary movement that ended with the establishment of the East German state. One that, as taught in Class 10 history, was born into a world where capitalist revolutions are giving way to the socialist revolutions. Ones that the West, the imperialists, are trying to suppress as they cling to the power of the old system. But according to Marx's theory, that old system is the basis for what comes next. It was a necessary step. East Germany was always concerned that if their youth were exposed to Western ideals, then they would abandon the state, or at least demand an equivalent. Things like the Western ideal of human rights, or Iron Maiden. The American and French revolutions were critical components in their teaching of history. They might have been bourgeois, but they were absolutely anti-feudal revolutions. And it is here that the understanding of human rights between the Western blocs and the Soviet blocs turns. To this day, the United States prides itself on the Declaration of Independence and the Bill of Rights, and the French the Declaration of the Rights of Man and the Citizen. But the American Revolution didn't bring freedom to everybody, and that's where it becomes super important for East Germany, and where it became important to teach why the Western ideals of human rights weren't actually the ideal. Because the Western ideals of human rights were centered in documents created by slave owners. And that is how East Germany threaded the needle on what was a legitimate human right or not. Human rights are worthless and can't be trusted when they are based on exploitation. History books spoke of the differences between how the new American state saw itself and its reality. Political cartoons mocked the concept of human rights as not actually protecting you. This one, from 1953, shows a man wrapped in the icons of capitalism, with the caption, "If only I had more human rights, then at least my feet wouldn't be cold." And the Stasi tied it all up in a bow. Western ideals of human rights only created class conflict. In a pamphlet put out in 1988, the Stasi explained the hypocrisies of Western human rights. Civil human rights in their development go back, among other things, to the civil philosopher John Locke. For Locke, this most important part, the original right of man, was property. Its inviolability should be enshrined in a social contract and defended against everyone by the state. As the pamphlet continued, Locke benefited directly from slavery in Carolina, America, and in the charter he drafted for this colony, there is this significant sentence: "Every free man shall have absolute power and authority over his slaves, regardless of their religion." It continued that Thomas Jefferson was, like George Washington, himself a slave owner. And when the Paris Revolutionary Declaration on the Rights of Man and the Citizen was incorporated into the first constitution of France in 1791, women were not even mentioned when people were mentioned. Like them, the workers had no right to vote, and they had to fight for it for 2 generations. Turning to the Bill of Rights, they state, the only concretely named right in the Bill of Rights is to acquire and possess property, the basis of the capitalist mode of production with all its consequences, to which we will return later. Consequences that are described with the beautiful words happiness, enjoyment of life, security, freedom, equality, or fraternity have nothing to do with it. Both the promises of the Virginia Bill of Rights and the Paris Declaration of the Rights of Man and Citizen became the forerunners of all today's capitalist human rights concepts and programs not redeemed by everyday capitalist life, by reality. What is being angled at is that human rights under capitalism don't give you anything but empty phrases, which the Stasi say is misconstrued by the West. Bourgeois historians conclude that the ignorance of human rights confirms our disregard for human rights. Such conclusions are of course nonsensical. When Karl Marx polemicized against the human rights articles of the American Bill of Rights, it is by no means because he would have been against freedom and human rights, quite the opposite. Marx ends his treatise with a call to achieve them. This call to achieve them, however, is something impossible under a capitalist society, thus the people's boot. It was imperative and necessary to deprive people of rights that were just for the protection of capital, as they might undo progress towards post-capitalism or the newly created social order. And also a law in East Germany, right next to it being illegal not to work. Human rights were sacred in East Germany. The ones that were being violated were only a right under capitalism. So thus, under a non-capitalist system, your rights weren't being violated. There are 2 ways of looking at freedom, best illustrated by this example. Say you're walking down a street and you see a man at the top of a water tower, and you know that he's not in his right mind because he's a Toronto Maple Leafs fan. He then says he is going to jump. Now, do you stop him from jumping, knowing that if he was in his right mind, he wouldn't want to jump? Or do you let him jump because he is free to make that decision? East Germany presented themselves as taking the first option. After all, as the Ministry for State Security, Erich Mielke, would say 5 days after the accidental opening of the Berlin Wall, and less than a month before he was charged with high treason,
Ich liebe doch alle Menschen.
I love everybody.